How do you know if a function is a function? Or rather, how do you know if a relation is a function? Well, the way you check is going to be different depending on how you're given data. So let's say we're looking at the first choice here. Let's say this one right here. That's a graph. Well, for a graph, that's where the vertical line test comes into play. Because you draw a vertical line and say, oh, it only crosses one time. So that makes it, yes, it's a function. Whereas if we had something that looked like this, well, that's not a function because a vertical line test says, oh, it crosses twice. If it ever crosses twice, it's not a function. Now, this is probably the way you learned. But what if you're given the data in a different format? For example, what if we're given this one? What if we have a chart? This is going to be completely different. You really can't use the vertical line test. Well, you could, but you'd have to plot it out. You'd have to plot it on the graph, draw a line there, and see, does it cross? But that's the hard way. Instead, all you have to do is just check these numbers here. Are there any repeats? 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is a function because I didn't repeat anything. But if I were to say, oh, here, let's put a 2 here. I don't really care what I put over here. How about I put a 5 there? Now it's not a function because there are two x's. That's kind of the same thing as the vertical line test. But for given a table or a chart like this, well, that matters more if you have a repeated number. That's basically the same thing. But I do want to point out that if we put an 8 here, then we just have a duplicate entry. But I've never really seen a teacher do that. So just note that if there's a duplicate here, it's probably going to be not a function, like in this case with this 2 and 5. Now, what about if you're given an equation? A lot of people have trouble with this. So let's talk about that as well. If I have it solve for y and I don't see anything funny, what does something funny mean? Well, a plus or minus is really the only way that it could be funny. Or if you're just not able to solve for y. That tells you it's not a function. But this one I solved for y, so this is yes. This one is a function because I can solve for y and there's nothing funny going on. If I look at the second option, let's take a look at this x squared plus y squared equals 5. If I were to try to solve for y, I would get y squared equals subtract x squared, so 5 minus x squared, and then I would take a square root. And that's where we run into problems. Because remember, whenever you take a square root, you have to do plus or minus. And if you ever see plus or minus, that's a telltale sign this is not a function. Because you have two different values of y for a unique x. If x is 0, say, then is it plus or minus root 5? I don't know. There are two values, so that means this is not a function. In fact, if you ever see y squared, be careful because y cubed does not mean that. But if you ever see y squared, there's a pretty good chance, if not almost, I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, it's not a function if you see a y squared in there.